Welcome back, everybody. Our next session today is entitled Pricing and Offsets, Building a Net Zero Investment Portfolio. To moderate this discussion on taxation, resolving carbon pricing issues and more, I'm pleased to welcome States of Guernsey Deputy and Chair of the Guernsey Green Finance Strategy Group, Deputy Nick Mokes. He is joined by Grant Cameron, 91 Guernsey Managing Director. 91 is an active global investment manager managing over £140 billion in assets, with a goal to provide long-term investment returns while making a positive difference to people on the planet. Grant has a particular interest in ensuring a just global transition. We also have Deloitte Associate Director Claire Galanou. Claire specialises in international taxation and climate change taxes, with a deep knowledge on government and corporate policies that drive change. From Guernsey, we have the International Stock Exchange CEO, Kees Vermaas. Kees has more than 20 years' experience within international financial market infrastructure. He's held senior executive positions within several international exchanges, including CME Europe, Euronext Amsterdam, and the New York Stock Exchange Euronext. Also joining from Carbon Tracker is Head of Research, Katharina Hillenbrand van den Ayen. Katharina is Head of Power, Utilities, and Clean Energy teams as an equity analyst. She has advised on some of the largest transformational financial transactions in the sector. Katharina is also a regulator and government advisor. As a senior advisor at the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, she shaped several key energy and climate policies in the UK, and she's also a member of the Task Force on Carbon Pricing in Europe. Finally, we have Rathbone Greenbank Investments Head of Ethical, Sustainable and Impact Research, Kate Elliott. Kate oversees sustainability assessment frameworks and analyses investments against ESG criteria. She also sets priorities for Greenbank stewardship activities. Thank you all for joining us and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I'll keep my preamble very short. We have got together 2 or 3 times ahead of this panel coming today, and we started off with a huge number of things we wanted to talk about and dozens of questions that we came up with that we thought you would want answers to. The reality is we have 45 minutes, so we've had to cut those right down. So what I would say to you is if you have still got a burning question at the end of this debate, do come and find us afterwards and we'll try to answer that question for you. And apologies if it's not asked actually whilst we're up here. So without further ado, I'm going to crack on. And firstly, we're looking at governments and taxation. And my question is for Katharina initially. And it's Denmark has recently introduced a corporate carbon tax. What do you feel is the trajectory of the carbon price for governments and corporates?
Well, we see a couple of principles. Firstly, we're seeming to see it across the board, and a lot of it actually following the UK example of the carbon floor price, which at the time I was actually involved with. But it seems we're seeing a farm market base, a lot of it based on the EU ETS. So we're seeing a market-driven base level, then topped up. So that's the second principle, topped up by a fiscal element. A fixed government determined according to its own criteria. And that seems to be going around sort of 100 euros a tonne level vaguely, which is again where we're then beginning to hit the abatement possibilities for the harder to abate industries. And then we are having this other principle which increasingly comes through as well, which is differentiation by industries. We're seeing it in many legislation very clearly as a result of reaction by industry and market forces. The harder to abate industries are getting leeway, are getting a framework to get in, so you get some differentiation, you get timing, but again, when you put this all together, you're having a framework, we're having a pricing level that will ultimately enable abatement for these difficult to abate industries, but giving them a time to get there. So I think that is probably where we're heading, and all of that driven by the market level. But the market does, at this point, not give us the full level, so which is why you need that fiscal top-up, which is then government set, and that's why we're going to have a lot of debate over what we're going to have to do about that.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I'll move to Claire now. We've seen different methods of pricing carbon, either offering tax benefits for those reducing carbon or increasing the cost of carbon to reflect the externalities in the cost of carbon. Which do you think works best for generating behavioural change? And what is the status of a globally agreed carbon price and carbon tax? Long question, I know.
That's a very long question. And actually, just to set the scene, I thought I would start with a quote from one of my favorite books, which is Dune by Frank Herbert. And it goes, "If we go on like this, we'll die of stupidity." So I'll let you ponder on this one. We've seen that sort of dystopian future is actually not so futuristic now, you know, with this summer, with heat waves, the flood in Pakistan. Sadly, you know, climate crisis is very much developing in front of our eyes right now. Luckily, you know, in COP26 in Glasgow last year, we saw a lot of target settings for net zero, which is really great to see. About 90% of global economy is now covered by those targets. It's how we're going to get there, really, that is, you know, at the front of the mind of governments and corporates at the moment. We will be able to solve climate crisis with 3 different things. Innovation, we're seeing a lot more of this, but it's still a bit slow. Substantial behavior change, and we'll see that tax can have an impact on this, and considerable economic cost. Obviously, the cost of inaction is also something big. Deloitte at Davos last year priced it at about $178 trillion in the next 50 years. So we see that inaction actually, you know, is not sustainable. Obviously, we might not even have a planet to see what that is really. So it is really big opportunities, you know, for finance in the next few decades, really. Where does tax fit in all of that? Well, you know, we can see a lot of great things coming in, especially in terms of behavior change. We've seen, for example, the sugar tax that has been, you know, tremendously worked in the UK. For example, personally, I don't buy Coca-Cola anymore just because it's increased the price by so much. In the environmental taxes, that can take the shape of plastic packaging tax that we've had in the UK since April this year, and is coming as well in Italy and Spain. So we'll probably see a lot more of this in the coming years. And that really has an impact on consumer products. We see, you know, packaging being replaced by glass, by paper. So this is really changing, you know, behavior all across the board. And then in terms of carbon pricing, as Katharina has just mentioned, really we see the UK ETS, the EU ETS. This is really something where we can see big things coming up. Carbon leakage is also a problem because obviously industries that are highly volatile and mobile can then change places. And so we see in the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism probably coming next year. So again, lots of development in this area. And then tax was actually mentioned only once during COP26, and that was around carbon pricing, potentially having an inclusion framework. Sadly, that's been a bit downgraded to an inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, which is very much data-driven and knowledge sharing. Is also a bit of a mouthful. So again, this is coming in the next few years. And really, in that sense, what we see as well is that all of that taxation and ETS and things like that, that's generating revenues for government to hopefully, you know, have a more just transition, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So tax is definitely part of the puzzle.
Brilliant, thank you. And Grant, how are your client bases approaching carbon pricing? Do you think the increasing cost of carbon is being modelled correctly?
Yeah, it's a good question, that, Nick. We're investment managers, and some of our clients are the biggest institutions and pension funds in the world. So clearly, they have applied their minds to this, some better than others. We have a Singapore client, Temasek, that's applied across the board, and now carbon price of $42 on every single one of their portfolio companies. They invest in other companies. Others less engaged, but obviously it's difficult to put a single price on carbon. We've heard already the range of prices. You can get a cheap voluntary carbon credit for $3. For example, we paid at 91, we bought carbon credits at $20, which I see is a lot less than what we'd have to pay for the Guernsey ones. But for most companies, it's very difficult to model this. Clearly, the first thing you've got to understand is what your emissions are in the first place. And we know about the greenhouse gas protocol, Scope 1 and Scope 2, direct and indirect, can be relatively easy to model, certainly when compared to the Scope 3, which is the value chain, both upward and downstream on the value chain, so to come up with the emissions. But once you've done that, you obviously then have to apply a price to it. And what price do you apply? We've talked earlier on the voluntary space, where the price ranges terribly depending on the quality of the project. Some of the costs can be already found on the income statement. So when you have a carbon tax, for example, that's sitting in the income statement. The emissions trading systems, you're paying for those, and there's a price on your income statement. So some of it's easier to measure, but clearly where it's difficult to measure, to quantify, is that price is going to increase the price of carbon. We talked about the voluntary carbon market. In 2021, it was about $1 billion. It's estimated, and this was more than what James was saying, certainly what I've read is estimated that market needs to be $50 billion by just after 2030 in order to meet the 2050 objectives. So clearly that, along with other factors around demand, the price of carbon is going to go up, and it's going to go up considerably. Bank of England in 2021 talked about companies preparing for a $100 price of carbon. And I don't think that's been correctly modeled. The last thing I just want to say is obviously the quantitative side and the modeling is very important, but you need to do the qualitative assessment as well to look at the risk of climate to your company.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Next, we'll touch on resolving some of the carbon issues that are out there. I apologise, this is another of my long questions, and it's aimed at Kees this time. Given what was discussed in the earlier panel today, what have been the stumbling blocks so far for the development of carbon markets, and how effective do you think segments such as Thai Sustainable and the LSE carbon market will be in accelerating the flow of capital?
Yeah, it's a long question, and there are several questions in between. And we have been learning actually from the previous panel a lot. At least personally, I've been learning a lot. So thank you very much for giving such a great insight. I just give a little bit my own view on the exchange kind of industry itself in order to create markets in general, because I've been active there for more or less 25 years. And then a little bit of perspective what we do with Thai Sustainable here in Guernsey. And also measure to the type of business we do as an exchange. So we are also called stock exchange, and actually we hardly trade stocks. So we are in that sense not comparable to London Stock Exchange, not even following the size and the scope of our companies, but also we do something much more niche and much more specialized. First of all, the stumbling blocks for creating a market, obviously, I have been personally involved in BlueNext, which was a carbon trading market voluntary, even before 2008. And I've been seeing from nearby that actually it was just not clear what was supposed to be. There was not enough information. The data was not correct. There was a lot of confusion on the market, and only some of the, let's say, it's my wording, shark-driven kind of investors saw opportunities and tried to misuse the carbon markets of that time. And that's why I think it failed. So lack of information, lack of liquidity, lack of participants, lack of education. And I am so happy to see that at this stage, we are so much more ahead than in 2008 or 2009, when we already looked with Euronext into the carbon markets. And I think there's much more likelihood that we succeed from here. And there's still a lot to do, obviously. So if you look at stock exchanges in itself, obviously London Stock Exchange, Euronext, Deutsche Börse, New York Stock Exchange, they have size, and they have actually direct access to all the listed firms, stakeholders in general, but listed firms, all directly into the boardrooms almost. I know because I've been myself in those roles, and there's almost an obligation, I think, and I would emphasize that. It's my personal opinion, but also discussing that with the team here in Guernsey, that if you can play that role, actually these kind of entities should, at this stage, much more demanding and setting the course how we get to this carbon neutral environment. That's easy to say. Then I come to Thijs. We do actually 98% of our business is corporate bonds. So we finance real economy companies which are doing, they're in a diversity of industries. And actually we don't even do the introduction. So we don't have the contact with investors. That's not what we do here in Guernsey. We just list. There's much more than that, but it looks simple. It's just listing. And we work with law firms and introducers and sponsor firms who have that contact. So we chose to be a good follower and to expose actually the good ESG companies or purposes for financing in order to expose them in a segment, and we call that Thijs Sustainable. And at least we start to collect data. We also get in contact with the companies or the intermediates who are in contact with the companies, the issuers, to try to get them on that segment. And we are actually very pleased to see that that segment is growing. So we started that whole Thijs Sustainable a little bit less than 1.5 years ago. And today we see that there is 13 billion of pounds being allocated in that segment. And it's all about the purpose for financing solar fields, or it's the company who is completely ESG minded. And obviously we do that via our membership, via the UN SSE, the Sustainable Stock Exchanges, which are actually providing us with education and also with all the rating kind of possibilities we have in order to put them in that segment. Last thing we chose, and we communicated that on that earlier this week, is that we see that there's a growth also in order to help companies to go from brown to green, to explain it in the most obvious way, because that is very costly. We heard it in the previous panel as well. If you have an operations and you have to move your company and transition towards being fully ESG or carbon neutral, that costs a lot of money. Takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And what we see in our specialized business is that the so-called transition bonds, or transition financing, is going to thrive enormously in the coming years. So we decided recently that we're going to dedicate a special segment for that and to try to stimulate and do our marketing and acquisition on that and try to grow that segment.
Thank you very much. On the same subject, a question for Kate now. How is the finance industry addressing challenges around carbon offsetting, such as additional and verification of offsets?
Yes, I might park additionality because I think Richard covered that on an earlier panel kind of far more clearly and eloquently than I could explain it. But I do think verification is worth digging into a little bit more. And that's all about how certain can we be that the promised carbon reduction from that carbon credit will actually result in the real world impact. And as buyers or investors in those carbon credits, it can be quite a challenge because there's often multiple layers that are standing in between you and the original project. So you might have the project and the originator of those carbon credits. You might then have an aggregator who works across a number of different projects and kind of parcels things up. You may then have a fund which then kind of, again, parcels that up, sells it on to the ultimate end purchaser. So you've got very little direct visibility and contact with the original source of those carbon credits. So you become very reliant on verification standards, on the reputation of the project originators and the aggregators. I think it's something between about 80 and 85% of the voluntary carbon market today is covered by 3 main verification standards. The rest of it is a kind of patchwork of smaller verification standards. But there's no one single kind of globally accepted framework of best practice. All of those different verification standards have different kind of criteria that they'll be applying. I think only one of those 3 main ones looks at social issues, for example. And if I may, I think that is one other really important point that we need to consider in terms of this verification. It's not just about the climate impact of this, because I think we can look through quite a narrow lens at kind of solving the issue of climate change, but it's really important to consider these are kind of real-world physical projects. If they're nature-based solutions, they have quite a large footprint often. So it's important in looking at the verification of these projects, assessing their overall sustainability, that we're also cognizant of things like human rights due diligence, at land rights, at potential kind of social or biodiversity co-benefits of them. And I think that's something that is quite often overlooked at this stage, but absolutely incredibly important.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Grant, another question for you. The just transition is essential when speaking about moving to net zero. Developing economies often contain the natural resources that have potential for offsets. How can developing economies benefit from carbon markets and offsetting, and what do we need to make this happen?
Yes, it's a topic quite close to my heart because 91 has an emerging market background, and the opportunity to generate revenue for projects in developing market is huge, and it's a real one for these economies. In terms of the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that a fair and just transition is needed, which will take into account the differences in the emerging markets. Clearly, we heard before, but 50% of the current problem on emissions is sitting in the emerging markets. But they only created 1/7. It's estimated 1/7 of the problem was created by them. They also don't have the resources to be able to apply large amounts of money. So the carbon credit market provides a great opportunity for them for money to flow into the right areas. But what is key, it's no good starving large emitters of capital. And currently a lot of the frameworks, the SFDR in the EU, those funds, if you're a high emitter, you can't invest in them. But obviously there's a real world issue here. If you're only investing into very clean companies and you're applying capital only to them, the biggest difference is going to be made from those high emitters moving towards less emissions. So you can't starve them from capital, and particularly in the developed markets. Emerging markets, obviously, because of their natural resources, a lot of the projects can initiate there. For example, on 91, I talked about ours. Ours is a Zambian deforestation project. But only 15% of all current foreign voluntary credit projects originated from Africa. Clearly, that's too low and needs to be increased. What is also imperative and needs to happen is to make sure that the revenue generated in the carbon credit market returns to the places where it's going to be of most need. Currently, there's far too many people in the value chain taking their portion of the voluntary credits. The bulk of that needs to go to the projects and the communities that it supports.
Okay, thank you. And Kate, do you agree?
Yeah, wholeheartedly. And I think that point about where the revenue ultimately ends up is absolutely key. Because if you get things right, then the carbon markets have this potential to bridge what we know is an absolutely vast funding gap in climate finance and the need for capital flows to go from developed markets to developing markets. That is a fundamental kind of principle of reaching net zero. But what we don't want to see is things that are poorly designed, where the kind of the benefits of that do not go back to the kind of communities where those projects are situated, because then you almost end up with a situation where it's kind of climate colonialism, and we're asking people, again, who have not been the primary source of the problem, to be the primary source of the solution. And that just isn't just, and that's a lot of what we talk about in terms of the just transition, because that is a concept that applies at quite a hyper-local level. It can be across particular industries, it can be at an international level, and it can also be intergenerational. So it's about thinking, again, taking that more holistic view, widening your lens from just climate, just this local area, to what are some of the unintended consequences, positive or negative, of the interventions that we're having.
Perfect, thank you. And now we're just going to focus on investment, which is the last section, incidentally. And the first question is for Kate, and it is, what are some of the portfolio and regulatory risks involved with the carbon price?
Is that me or
Kate.
Oh, sorry. That's how I've done my homework. I mean, I think we see kind of regulatory risks in two forms, and it depends whether you're thinking about the compliance-based market, so things like the EU emissions trading scheme, where it can be quite kind of binary compliance risks. So it could be, there was a debate recently about whether financial markets should be able to participate in the kind of carbon credit scheme as a whole. But then if we look at the voluntary market, the regulation risk is very much around the carbon price. It's about providing the kind of certainty of policy direction which will underpin and help to provide a floor to the carbon price, so that, as we heard on the previous panel, people can see through the short-term volatility in that and can start projecting through within their own net zero plans of what is the cost differential between mitigating emissions and offsetting them. We obviously want to see it sit within that mitigation hierarchy, and we want to see people reducing as much as they possibly can, and only offsetting residual emissions. But if we see continued uncertainty around the carbon price, continued kind of quite significant volatility within it, it makes it quite difficult to plan that out over 5, 10, 15-year time horizons. So really, yeah, it just needs to be something that is looked at, and I think governments tend to be very, very bad at this. They take a very short-term perspective on things. I think there needs to be a much more long-term view taken on that, and long-term support for the climate, for the carbon price.
Okay, thank you. And Katarina, do you agree? I mean, what is your understanding of some of the risks in understanding the changes in carbon pricing?
Well, you get it at various levels. You get it at the investor level, and you get it at the corporate level. Now, when you look at the corporate level, companies need planning, and they actually are looking for long-term planning. So if they have visibility on a long-term price, they can incorporate that, and they need. So a lot of the big work that we do is about project sanctioning. So what projects do companies sanction? And you can say, well, there is a chunk of projects that are simply unviable in a net zero world, which applies largely to the fossil fuel companies. Those should not be sanctioned anyway, because you can even take a market-based logic, the demand will not be there. Now, there is an underlying carbon pricing view. You don't need an awful lot. You can even take relative economics. But if you then move a step further to the more complicated industries, cement and steel, aviation, all of those, there you become more heavily dependent on a carbon price. And I've even heard it at various stages from corporates. We actually would like one because, again, those companies also sanction industrial and CapEx projects. And they actually want a hurdle rate to know where they're going, which then, again, if you have different views and lack of transparency, you may have investors imposing something of them which corporates then don't buy. You get the wrong CapEx decisions. You get the famous asset stranding on the back of it. And all of that could be avoided with a transparent and indeed a carbon price that industry and investors could look through.
Okay, thank you.
Can I say
please.
something about it? For me, this is absolutely true. For me, the danger is that you are entering with this voluntary and not know what the price is and the price, that you attract speculation, or for the sake of continuity for companies, you attract a whole kind of new market, which is like we see in the derivative markets today on energy and currencies, for instance. And I wonder if that's a good thing in general. I would much more promote that this is more directive, a meta plan, and much more directed by governments, regulators, in order to keep that going. Otherwise, you get to an capitalistic system again on top of something where you don't want to be.
Okay, and Claire, you're nodding vigorously there. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. Especially the stranded asset is going to be a big problem for some, as we said, the brown assets and how we go from brown to green is definitely going to be very important in the next few years.
And I should think it is very important in this whole debate about voluntaries and offsetting that. Again, you must differentiate between industries, because there are industries that do not require offsetting, that simply need to shift their business model. There are others where all of this makes a lot of sense, where they haven't got a choice or haven't got the choice yet. And this is, again, where regulation might come in. Investor pressure will come through, but also it's about disclosure. I mean, if you look at some of the companies, looking at their offsetting projects, the amount of forest that you have to build would be 5 times Brazil all over, which is clearly not going to happen, is it? So in that sense, you have to have some kind of, if you can come up with the transparency so that the investing chain can actually look at that, you can then differentiate between industries and see where is the viability of, which again, going back, then helps price finding in the marketplace.
Okay.
And it is a real challenge. I mean, we have a lot of conversations at the moment with companies on their net zero strategies, and one of the questions we ask is things around what is your internal cost of carbon, how is that factoring into your CapEx decisions, into your kind of, essentially, what is the cost to that organisation of transition? And there is a vast range in both kind of where companies are in terms of their timeline on thinking of that, from, oh, good question, haven't even considered it, which is worrying, to we've got this whole plan thought through, really glad you've asked us about it, here's the spreadsheet, but also huge variability in what cost of carbon they're putting in. And that is a risk in the markets that I don't think is properly acknowledged at the moment.
Okay. Grant, do you have any thoughts on this particular area? Or?
Yeah, I think, and wanted to tell a very quick story. You know, Anglo-American, most of us have heard of it, divested of its coal operations. And at that time, we thought it would be a good idea to have those coal operations transition to a more renewable source of energy. And we went to all our clients, and except for one, which was a German insurance company, they all said, great idea, but we can't invest in a coal company. It was just ruled out. Subsequently, Anglo-American divested, and Thungela, those South Africans might know, was the coal company that was created. It's now up 800%, and it's increasing its coal operations. So that's exactly the type of outcome we have as a challenge. If you completely eliminate the investment in coal companies, you might find that exactly that happens, that the investors see that the returns could be generated there and thus go that route. So I think that's a concern around just merely excluding large emitters.
Okay. And again, for you, Grant, what are some of the success stories, or can you think of any other success stories, in fact, because you just mentioned one, in the investable opportunities within building a net zero portfolio?
Yeah, there's obviously been, in the UK, companies like Lion Trust and Royal London in our space have built very successful, sustainable funds, raised a lot of money there, and performance hasn't suffered as a result. In 91, we have our own global environment fund, which is 2 billion in the UK OIC and $1 billion in the Luxembourg CCAV version of that. Again, that's been very successful on the back of very good performance. So there are a lot of success stories. We've got to be careful of greenwashing, which is very prevalent in our industry. Those of you who follow the SFDR will know that Article 8 funds are very prevalent. Some companies put the bulk of their funds into Article 8. They're getting increasingly found out now, but it's very slow. And those funds of ours, for example, we talk about when we do presentation, there's a company in the US called Next Era Energy. I don't know if any of you heard of it, but it's probably the biggest utilities company in the world, over 100 billion market cap. It a long time ago decided on the renewable route, and it actually, well, on its website it says it's the company that generates more energy from solar and wind than any other company in the world. That company has outperformed all its peers in the utilities, admittedly quite a boring sector, utility sectors in the US. But if that's a good example, you don't have to suffer as a result of going the renewable route. You can be a very, very successful company, and more so than some of the others that didn't go that route.
Fabulous, thank you. And final question, I think, because of timings. Claire, how important do your clients feel the move to net zero is?
Yeah, I think Kate really mentioned that before. I think we see a huge difference between those that are over-prepared and those that are under-prepared. I think it's something we see, as you mentioned, internal pricing. We've got a lot of clients that are very much going into that route. As we said as well with Katharina, it's a lot easier when there's regulatory or transparency background and very strict framework in that sense. So we really see very, very different things. I think one thing that we see a lot more in the offsetting market is, or the voluntary aspect of it, is we see a lot of clients that are actually very engaging with their local communities, and they don't want to just invest, just put money somewhere. They actually want to do something locally. So in the UK, obviously, we have a lot of peatland, very hard for me to pronounce, that are, peatland projects. We have forests in Scotland and things like that. So that's very much impacting communities. And again, that's something you've mentioned, Kate. That's really important for those large corporates, and also because it's also a tool to attract talents and retain their workers' engagement. That's something, newer generation, the Gen Z or millennials are very interested in, to see what they can do. And it's not just, buying offsets somewhere. It's actually putting your hands in it and helping locally. And even personally, from my personal experience, when we look at offsets, I was saying a colleague earlier, my husband was renewing our car insurance, and apparently with the new one we bought, they have direct offsets of our mileage, which is just incredible. It's a nice bonus. So I think we will see a lot more of that as well. When you buy your flights, you can get your offsets as well. So this is definitely something we see a lot of as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for, so thank you to the panel, wonderful. And as I said at the very beginning, if we've glossed over something you're particularly interested in or completely missed it, do come and find us shortly, and we'd be very happy to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our panelists there for all your input and adding a kind of few more layers to help break down those complexities around carbon pricing and its integration into investment portfolios. Now, for our closing keynote, we have something a little different. I think when working in sustainable finance, it's so important to remember and recognise why we're all here. We are delighted today to have photographer and explorer Martin Hartley joining us to remind us why we need to decarbonise and combat climate change. Martin is an award-winning expedition and adventure photographer. He has spent the last 20 years documenting the Arctic Ocean, a place he argues is the most important and most fragile place on our planet right now. During his expeditions, he has seen firsthand the damage climate change is doing to our planet. I can't think of a better way to bring home some of the messages of what this week has all been about from someone who has seen it firsthand with his own eyes. You'll also be able to see some of Martin's work later on during our drinks reception. We're first going to show a very short video of Martin's next expedition before welcoming Martin to the stage.
10 years ago, I thought my photographs of the Arctic would be valuable in maybe 100 years, long after I'm gone. That concept has changed so much, way faster than science ever predicted. Now those photographs are becoming a rare documentation of an environment I love that may be shockingly extinct in my lifetime. This is the thickest ice at the top of the world that cools all of the planet. It's predicted to disappear in the next 10 years. Billions of lives will be affected if it does, including yours and mine. Surprisingly, we know very little about it. So this expedition will set out to record, measure and film what's left of it. It'll tell us without doubt just how serious climate change is. I'm so afraid these last ice sentinels will be lost, and lost forever. It's driving me to do one last expedition to record these last ice sentinels before they're gone. These pieces of ice, they're not just beautiful. They're important to you, they're important to me, and to everyone on the planet. Without them, life on Earth will be very different. People need to understand what's going on at the top of the world. And they need to fall in love with the ice in the same way that I have. If this expedition can bring home to everyone just how connected we all are to these pieces of ice, and just how important they are to all of us. I believe there's a chance we can save them. Well, thanks for having me here, and I have to say I'm going to leave here with a lot more hope than when I arrived. I've been here all week listening to you guys talk stuff I don't actually understand anything about. That carbon stuff there, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm not even sure it was English. There's only two finance terms I know. One of them is overdrawn, and the other one is overdraft. So that's the extent of my financial and economic knowledge. Anyway, I have learnt quite a few things, but what I have seen here, which has filled me with a lot of hope, is even though I don't know anything about the stuff you're talking about, what is consistent every single day with every single conversation on a panel or in a workshop is that everyone seems to be passionate about what they do, which I'm not interested in numbers or cash or anything of that nature. My interest lies in other things, but I do know that if you're passionate about what you're working on, you're going to be very good at it. And hearing, I think it was Richard say he was excited about all this carbon stuff, I don't know what he was talking about, but he seemed really excited about the numbers and the way things were unfolding. So that's reassuring to see and hear and feel that energy when you're actually, the people in the room here are the people that are going to solve this problem. Because you can move really quickly and you can change things fast. Politicians are slow moving, even slower moving than an average glacier. They don't get things done, they can't make decisions, and money does make the world go round, and you can have the biggest influence and the most effective change the quickest way. And it's really reassuring for me, who has seen the damage that has been done firsthand over the last 20 years on the top of the planet. And if you look on your tables, there's jugs of water here and there. If you think of that vessel, the jug, as the planet, and at the top of it, some of them have ice, some don't. The ones that have ice in, that ice cools everything beneath it. And it's the same with the Arctic Ocean. That 5.5 million square miles of sea ice at the top of the planet cools everything beneath it. Even though the oceans have different names, it's one body of water. And the sole mechanism for cooling it isn't Antarctica, because that is ice sheet that's sat on land, and the same with Greenland, although Greenland is now having a massive effect on the temperature of the ocean and the acidity of it. But it is the ice at the top of the planet here that cools everything south of it. And one thing I didn't realise until a few weeks ago is that 90% of the human population live in the Northern Hemisphere. And the Arctic Ocean gives us all the weather that we get in the Northern Hemisphere. So I'm going to hopefully try and fill the knowledge gap that exists between what people think the Arctic Ocean is, and even where it is in fact, and how we're all connected to it every single day of our lives. So I first stood on the edge of the Arctic Ocean 20 odd years ago, and I've been to the Himalayas in the winter, I've been to deserts and mountains and jungles, and I've never experienced such a powerful force of nature as I did standing here at the edge of the most northerly point in Canada, which is in the back of the picture there. You can see the skyline of the mountains, and beyond that is the Arctic Ocean, and it affected me in a way. It took me a long time to realise what had happened when I saw what I was looking at. It's taken me a long time to understand what the Arctic Ocean is and what it means to the rest of the planet. So this is what the Arctic Ocean looked like in the mid-80s. There was this 5.5 million square miles across, and the average extent of this kind of ice was 3.5 to 4 million square miles of ice that survives all year round. And this ice, when you're in it, when you're amongst it, it has the same effect as walking past an oven door when it's open, but it's pushing cold onto you, not heat. It's a really strange sensation. And sometimes when you walk past something like this, you almost have to turn your head away because the cold it's pushing on you is so powerful, you have to deflect your head away from it. And that is the cooling mechanism of the ice that transfers through the oceans to the far south of the globe. And the reason why so little is known about the Arctic compared to Antarctica, in Antarctica there's 4,000 scientists live at the South Pole on the coastline all year round. So they're able to study it and observe it and sample it and measure it all year round. Nobody lives on the Arctic Ocean. Nothing lives there. There's no houses, there's no huts. The only wildlife up there is the occasional polar bear and the odd seal, and maybe the odd Arctic fox. That's why it's so little understood. To get there is expensive, and once you're there, it's very risky to stay there, and it's very difficult to get out once you're there. So all those things combined mean that scientists cannot really get in there and gather data quickly enough. They can go on the edges of it and they can hang around for a couple of hours before the helicopter gets too cold and they have to fly back. So I spent the last 20 odd years gathering data for scientists to help them calibrate the satellites and understand what's happening with the ice and underneath it and on top of it. Navigation's a problem. It's the only place in the world where you can put your tent up and get in it and not where you're going to wake up in the morning because the sea ice is drifting around constantly. Imagine parking your car in Manchester and going to sleep and then waking up in Sheffield. It's a bit like that. Nobody wants to wake up in Sheffield. So moving around up there to collect data is really difficult. Every single 100 metres is an unknown obstacle ahead of you, not like Antarctica, where every single metre is known and it's Groundhog Day for every single part of the journey. In the Arctic, there's all different kinds of ice. The average thickness nowadays is 1.7 metres, and it used to be 4 metres. It shrank in the last 20 years by 85% in terms of volume and coverage. And the old thick ice that I've just been showing you, that has been reduced by 95% in the last 10 years alone. I know you guys like percentages and forecasts and things like that. The horrific numbers in the Arctic, our scientists are telling us, forecasting, that since the 1985, this total sea ice loss has gone down by 13% per decade, which is where that figure came from, the BBC footage before, which the prediction is that they will be gone by 2035. And one reason we need that white cap at the top of the planet is because the sun's radiation hits it and bounces off and deflects about 85-90% of the solar radiation back into outer space. Without that, you've got a 5.5 million square miles of black hole absorbing the sun's radiation directly into the ocean. And there's a positive feedback mechanism in that the snow disappears off the mountains, the surrounding landscape heats up, and that heats up the water on the coastline of the Arctic. So it is a desperate situation that we're faced with, and the current trends are that we are not going to meet the 1.5 target, no matter how hard we try. And of course, being an ocean, it's affected by the full moon, and if you're camping up there 3 days before a full moon, the ice breaks up, and 3 days afterwards, and it becomes very mobile. And because the ice isn't locked around the Russian, Alaskan, Norwegian, Canadian, American borders anymore, it's so much more mobile and so much more fragile and susceptible to being broken up, which increases its rate of melt. That graph tells you, I only like graphs, I've seen a few of those this week. Didn't understand any of them. This one's pretty simple. That blue line that goes up and down is the average sea ice extent, because the sea ice on the Arctic Ocean, it grows in the winter and then melts in the summer, a kind of pulsing mechanism year round. But what's happening is now it doesn't grow back as much in the winter and it retreats a lot faster in the summer, so it's less and less and less of it. On the left of the picture there, you can see the white stuff. That's the ice that is the multi-year sea ice, the thickest ice on the planet. That's the stuff that keeps the planet cold. That is the air conditioning system of the planet. And you can see there in 2018 how little of that is left. And the white circle with the word Beaufort Gyre in, that is where, that was a current in the Arctic Ocean where the sea ice used to grow thick and become more resilient to the summers, and then eventually the ice would drift out further east across the coast of America and Canada, and then drift off eventually after 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the east coast of Greenland there. That gyre has slowed down so much now. There's water coming up between the Bering Straits, that's the bit between Alaska and Russia. Warm water's creeping into the Arctic there, and the ice doesn't get a chance to grow thick anymore. And this is a sentinel. This is what the Arctic Ocean used to look like. This ice takes a lot of melting. This is really robust stuff, and this is the stuff we need to preserve at the top of the planet. And all the work you're putting into these numbers and crunching things in order to reach this net zero, you're protecting this ice by doing all that work. That's why we're here. Climate change is a complicated beast, and the cause and effect of losing the ice is felt everywhere. The flooding in Pakistan, the typhoons in Japan, the forest fires in Australia, and these hot dry spells we're having in the UK now, that's all because this ice at the top of the planet is disappearing. So if you're having a bad day at work because things aren't going well or you're not meeting targets, just remember in the back of your mind you're doing your job to protect this. Nature doesn't need us, but we need nature. And a question crops up in the week, which I was horrified at, but I understand the context of it. I never thought I'd hear it. And the question appeared in a biodiversity panel, which was, does nature have an intrinsic value? And whatever context that question is put, nature is absolutely the most priceless thing in the universe. You take one step out of our solar system and there's nothing else beyond it. And quite often I'll be sat on the Arctic Ocean freezing, wondering why it's minus 50 here and where I am in the Arctic, and then plus 50 in the equator, which is only 6,500 miles away. Imagine if Earth was 6,500 miles close to the sun. Life would be very different. And the other question that people seem to hear is, why does 2 degrees Celsius matter? Well, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You go from this room upstairs and there's probably a 10 degrees Celsius difference and we don't notice it initially. But if you think water in the glass there, that is 1 degree Celsius. As soon as that transitions to 0 Celsius, it becomes solid and it becomes ice. And if you've got a temperature that's in your body that's 2 degrees or higher or 2 degrees lower, you're sick. So those 2 degrees Celsius is quite a big margin in terms of global average, and it means a lot to the natural world, that difference in temperature. This is what the sea ice looks like now. That's what it was in the mid-80s, and this is what we're faced with now. And this is ice that grows in the winter and the autumn and the spring, and it's all gone by the summer. And I spent 3 weeks living on this kind of ice, hopping from those lumps of ice. It's absolutely terrifying. There's no way we could get out of the Arctic, no way a plane could come in and land on this stuff. And this is what we're faced with nowadays, trying to collect data for scientists. It's a risky business, but it has to be done because the satellites are just best guessing what's going on, which is why these forecasts are so wide and varied. And when the ice breaks up and it exposes these black areas, not only does the sun radiation go into the water, the ice that's keeping the heat in the Arctic Ocean comes out and heats up the atmosphere. So it's a double positive feedback mechanism. So now when we're going out to the Arctic Ocean, collecting data, the sledges have now been modified so that we can use them as flotation devices to get across large areas of water. Sometimes you have to get in the water and swim across because it's impossible to paddle across certain types of thin ice. And I was chatting with this chap, Professor Christian Haas, a few months ago. And scientists, they're not really allowed themselves to be vocal about things because science is an exact thing, like your number crunching is an exact thing. You can't forecast things and get it wrong and expect to get credibility for getting things wrong. And scientists don't like getting things wrong because that's why they're scientists. But this guy here, I was relieved to hear him being so outspoken after 30 years of researching the Arctic Ocean, He's the world's leading sea ice expert. And to hear him say this brings home everything that we're facing right now as a species. And if we do lose the sea ice, life on Earth is going to be very different for everyone. The good news is there's a little glimmer of hope in this, which the sea ice doesn't have a tipping point. So if the sea ice does all go one summer, if we have a really cold winter, it'll grow back really quickly. And if we can bring those global average temperature rises back to normal, the sea ice will grow back and the Arctic will return to its former glory. So that's what we need to be aiming for. My next expedition, which I'm currently fundraising for, is I'm working with the European Space Agency to go back onto the Arctic Ocean to try and find and photograph and make a film about this incredible multi-year sea ice. And if you look at this is a satellite image from February 22 this year. The red spots is where the thick ice remains. So if you look back in 1985, where it was then, and look where it is now, you can see it's nearly all gone. And this is the stuff we really need to work hard to preserve. And the route I'll be taking is from Ellesmere Island, Canada, across south of Lincoln Sea here, across to northern Greenland, to photograph and document this ice, take samples to help recalibrate the Cryosat-2 satellite for the European Space Agency, and also to make a feature documentary to fill this knowledge gap about the understanding of the Arctic Ocean, and because the perception of it is so limited everywhere with everyone about its function with the climate. That's the red line is the proposed route there. I'm just waiting for the scientists to let us know where the most likely spots are for this ice. But basically, that red line is where the last of the old ice is. Thank you very much.
I don't really have anything to say to follow that, Martin. Thank you so much for showing those images. I can't wait to see your exhibition later and hope everyone here comes and joins and sees those photographs and sees the evidence of climate change that you've captured over the years. We are now coming to the end of a fantastic week, so before Rupert closes us out, I would like to extend my thanks to all of you for coming and the incredible team at Guernsey Finance and everyone here who's made it possible. I do have one last person to hand you over to. We're so grateful to all of our sponsors for their support of Sustainable Finance Week. Today's headline sponsor is RBSI International. And to speak to you on their behalf, I'm pleased to welcome Managing Director of Institutional Banking, Susan Fauquier.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very hard act to follow, Martin. Thank you everyone for coming today. We're really proud to be today's headline sponsor for this year's Sustainable Finance Week. ESG and sustainable finance is a key part of our purpose-led strategy, and it's been great to see RBS International colleagues and NatWest Group colleagues come and support this event, which obviously has wider industry participation, and it's been fantastic to have the opportunity to discuss these important topics. I want to personally thank We Are Guernsey for organising a fantastic lineup of speakers, providing us with a really great opportunity to discuss the climate challenge. So thank you to all the speakers. Today's sessions have been fantastic, and I think, Martin, you really demonstrated how critical it is for us all to take action quickly. At RBS International, sustainability is at the heart of everything we're doing, and we're building a more sustainable and resilient future in three main ways. We're making our own operations climate positive, we're empowering our colleagues to live more sustainably, and we're innovating products and services to support our customers in the transition to a low-carbon economy. This has been underpinned by the creation of an in-house ESG strategy team, and we're pleased that Bradley's with us today, which is responsible for driving sustainable outcomes for our customers across our jurisdictions. We're committed to being a responsible lender, And we provided around 2.3 billion of climate and sustainable finance to our customers over the last couple of years, including 1.3 billion in sustainability linked loans. And that's where we're requiring customers to demonstrate material progress against predetermined ESG targets. We're also investing in digital to transform how we work through partnerships and co-creation and innovation. So, for example, our depository business is working on a digital reporting tool to analyse ESG data, and that will help customers track how well funds perform against their ESG criteria. So I think we're all agreed today that climate change is the challenge of our time. And finance has got a key role to play in that journey to net zero. So thank you for your attendance, taking the time to come along this week and listen to all the speakers. And thank you for any personal pledges that you take away from this week to accelerate the solutions. I'm going to hand over to Rupert now, but thank you very much.
I do appreciate it's Thursday. It is the final day. But I'm quite dumbfounded by what Martin just said. Quite an amazing way to close off our final day. Hearing from somebody who's witnessed the effects of climate change firsthand absolutely hammers home the messages that we've been trying to put across this week. The urgent need for action and the importance that the finance industry can really make with these issues. There's nothing quite like seeing the evidence laid out in front of you. Thanks to Susan for her address on behalf of headline sponsor RBS International. Thank you, Susan, and her team. So before I bring this event to a close and we reconvene for drinks and networking, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support of this event. RBS International, again, as today's headline sponsor. I'd like to thank the International Stock Exchange as our first ever carbon offset sponsor, as well as registration sponsor OSIA, coffee sponsor KPMG, and to locate Guernsey, our exhibit sponsor. Not forgetting the Duke of Richmond Hotel for hosting us this week, and also our valued media partner, the Financial Times. If you want to know more, we have an extensive library of literature on Guernsey's role in sustainable finance. You can also read our new report, Private Finance and its Role in Supporting the Transition to Net Zero, that I mentioned earlier in full. Simply head to our website and click either the Literature or the Resources tab, from which you'll be able to filter to the correct topic. Or simply scan the QR codes on the event banners that you'll see dotted around the venue, and that will take you straight there. It's also very important for us to know what you thought of today's event so that we make them even better in the future. Therefore, if we could ask you to kindly take a moment to complete our online survey, which will be sent to you in due course in a post-event email. We'd also appreciate if you could place your lanyards in the bowls on the registration desk on the way out to let us know how you feel the event went. As I mentioned yesterday, the Art for Guernsey exhibition specifically commissioned for Sustainable Finance Week will remain in the Royal Court until the close of business tomorrow, and if you do have time, I'd urge you to go and have a look. At the end of the day, we have something a little special to you, as Steph alluded to. We've just heard from Martin, and during our drinks and networking reception, you can enjoy an exhibition of his work, photographing the polar ice caps and the impacts that he's seen firsthand, and the changing climate. This exhibition will focus our minds on the enormous task we face, but hopefully the discussions that we've had this week have left you with a clear understanding of the power that the finance industry can make to help to alleviate climate change and help us on course to go forth and make a real difference. So that all remains for me is to thank you again for coming today and supporting Guernsey Sustainable Finance Week 2022, especially those of you who've made a special trip to the island for the event, and I wish you all a very safe journey home. Enjoy the exhibition upstairs, which you'll find at the back and up onto the terrace, and we look forward to catching up with you in the not-so-distant future. On behalf of Guernsey Finance, thank you very much and see you next year.